Henry VIII, the man who once towered over the throne of England, is often remembered for his 6 wives, his role in the founding of the Church of England, and his ruthless reign. But what history books rarely tell you is just how far this mighty monarch fell into a realm of grotesque physical decline and mental instability. By the end of his life, Henry was no longer a king. He was a walking corpse, a decaying shell of the powerful ruler he once was. Let's start with the most shocking truth about Henry VIII. By the time he died, his body had become a grotesque, almost unrecognizable horror. Henry's waistline had expanded to a staggering 54 inches. To put that into perspective, that's larger than the average person's height in his time. This was a king whose girth was so immense that his movement was restricted, and who, despite his royal status, could barely walk. At the height of his obesity, Henry weighed roughly 400 pounds. In an era where the average man weighed around 140 pounds, this was beyond the realm of normality. It was a living, breathing spectacle of excess. But Henry's descent into grotesquerie wasn't limited to his weight. It wasn't just obesity that consumed Henry, it was his health. His legs were covered in festering ulcers, wounds that refused to heal, no matter what treatments were tried. These weren't the small, superficial injuries one might expect from a king. They were massive, oozing sores, constantly leaking pus and rotting flesh. The smell, so overpowering, was said to be detectable from rooms away. Courtiers, too terrified to get close to him, resorted to holding perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces to block out the horrific stench. In fact, many servants even drew straws to determine who would have the dreaded task of dressing him. The unlucky ones, tasked with tending to the king's wounds, were subjected to what was essentially a punishment, a grisly reminder of the decaying monarch they served. But what did these horrific physical symptoms mean for Henry? It wasn't just the stench that isolated him from his court, or his inability to move without assistance. Historians now believe that Henry suffered from a severe and likely life-changing injury, a jousting accident in 1536. The injury left him unconscious for 2 full hours, which in medieval terms meant he was nearly dead. This wasn't a small bump on the head, it was a trauma that left a profound impact on his mental state. His behavior, previously marked by youthful confidence, turned to paranoia, rage, and irrationality. It is here, in the aftermath of this traumatic injury, that the transformation from the charming and relatively balanced young king to the tyrannical, unpredictable monarch we remember began. Moreover, modern experts have posited that Henry may have had Cushing's syndrome. This condition, caused by a tumor in the adrenal glands, could explain not only his dramatic weight gain but also his mood swings, his irrational bursts of anger, and the painful, ulcerating wounds on his legs. And the real tragedy was that no one in his court dared suggest that the king might be seriously ill. Criticizing the monarch's health was considered treason, and so his doctors kept their mouths shut, fearing for their lives. It's chilling to think that a man who claimed divine right to rule someone whose word was law couldn't even control his own body. By his final years, Henry's health had deteriorated to such a point that royal attendants had to carry special chairs to accommodate him wherever he went, as he could no longer walk without incident. His body betrayed him in ways that even the most severe monarchs had never imagined. But the tragic reality of Henry's physical decay did not stop there. The man who had once commanded the respect of an empire was now a prisoner of his own body. Even his bodily functions betrayed him. He was unable to control his bowels, and there were instances where attendants had to follow behind him with cloths to clean up his mess. This was the man who had executed so many in fits of rage. He was feared for his temper and unpredictable moods, but now he was a broken, decaying king, unable to govern even his own physical form. His final years were marked by a complete and utter unraveling, not only of his mind but also of his body. And yet, despite all of this, he remained a monarch, his court still groveling at his feet, ignoring the truth of his rot. As Henry VIII's body decayed, so too did his mind. The man who once exuded confidence, charm, and a sense of control transformed into a paranoid, unstable ruler, whose reign became a nightmare for everyone around him. His insecurities, once hidden behind the veneer of royal authority, began to crack open, revealing a deeply disturbed monarch whose every action seemed driven by an ever-present fear of betrayal. And at the heart of this paranoia were the women in his life, his wives. Let's begin with the most famous example, Anne Boleyn. Anne's execution is one of the most infamous moments in English history. But what most people don't know is that it wasn't just an impulsive decision. Henry didn't simply wake up one day and decide to have his second wife executed. No, he orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy to have her framed. Anne was accused of adultery, incest, and plotting to kill the king. The evidence against her was fabricated, much of it obtained through torture. But it didn't stop there. Henry demanded that Anne's own musician, someone who had once been her confidant, confess under duress to having had an affair with her. This forced confession was the final nail in her coffin. But what made Anne's torment so uniquely cruel was the psychological torture she endured before her death. Henry had her watch as 5 innocent men, including her own brother, were executed for allegedly sleeping with her. Anne had to stand there, helpless, knowing she was next. Imagine the horror of witnessing your own loved ones die because of a paranoid fantasy your husband had cooked up. And then, as Anne was led to the scaffold, Henry's cruelty reached its peak. He forced her to sign papers for her own annulment, basically a death sentence wrapped in the formalities of royal bureaucracy. But Anne wasn't the only wife who would feel the full brunt of Henry's twisted mind. Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife, found herself trapped in a web of fear and suspicion. Catherine, barely out of her teens when she married Henry, was subjected to an unbearable level of psychological abuse. When Henry discovered that she had a history of relationships before their marriage, his rage knew no bounds. Rather than simply executing her, Henry went a step further. He passed a law making it treason for anyone to marry the king without revealing their sexual history. Imagine living in a world where your very marriage could be deemed illegal if you didn't bear every intimate detail of your past. This was the reality Catherine faced, and her punishment was swift and brutal. Her fate was sealed when Henry discovered her past flirtations, and within months, she was arrested, accused of adultery, and executed. The psychological toll on her must have been immense. She went from the excitement of a young queen to the depths of despair as she awaited her death, all because of Henry's insatiable paranoia. But Henry didn't just destroy the lives of his wives through execution. The psychological abuse he subjected them to was devastating. Take Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. Their marriage had once been built on love, but after years of infertility and frustration, Henry grew tired of her. He was obsessed with the idea of having a male heir, and when it became clear that Catherine could not provide one, Henry's feelings turned to disdain. Catherine's punishment, however, was not swift. She was confined to a life of isolation, forbidden from seeing her daughter, Mary, and denied any official status as the queen. Henry spread rumors that Catherine was mentally ill, undermining her credibility and isolating her even further. Her final years were spent in loneliness, writing desperate letters to Henry that were never read. Anne of Cleves, another of Henry's wives, had a different, yet equally traumatic experience. When Henry married her, he was convinced that she was the answer to his problems. But upon meeting her, he found her unappealing and soon sought to annul the marriage. But here's the cruel twist: he didn't just divorce her. He made her agree to the annulment, essentially pretending that their marriage had never existed. Anne, terrified of the repercussions if she fought back, signed the papers, thanking Henry for sparing her life. She was forced to pretend that she was grateful for being discarded like a worn-out garment. And let's not forget Jane Seymour, the one wife who died naturally, at least in the traditional sense. She passed away from complications following childbirth, but the true horror lay in the fact that Henry had already begun planning his next marriage before her funeral was even over. Just 9 days after Jane's death, Henry was eyeing his next bride, already moving on to the next chapter in his quest for a male heir. Jane's death, though tragic, was merely a pause in the relentless march of Henry's obsession with power and control. Henry's treatment of his wives went beyond the executioner's axe. It was a deliberate and calculated process of emotional and psychological torment. His wives were not just victims of a king's wrath, they were casualties of a system built on control, fear, and paranoia. And yet, no matter how badly he treated them, they had no way to escape. Divorce was not an option. Running away meant certain death. Fighting back could lead to the execution of their entire family. Henry's paranoia had a ripple effect on his court. His actions didn't just affect his wives, his entire kingdom became a place where no one was safe from his wrath. The fear of crossing the king grew so great that even the courtiers who had once been his closest allies began to live in constant dread. It was a psychological prison, where saying the wrong thing, or even looking at the king the wrong way, could lead to death. Henry VIII's paranoia transformed not only his physical appearance but also the very structure of his court. It became a place where fear and suspicion reigned supreme, and where even the most intimate relationships could be shattered at a moment's notice. His wives may have been the most visible victims, but the entire kingdom was caught in the web of his paranoid mind. As Henry VIII's body deteriorated, so did his habits. What had once been a kingly appetite for fine food and drink became an obsession, a grotesque spectacle that mirrored his mental and physical unraveling. In the latter part of his reign, Henry's eating habits were not only excessive, they were absolutely insane. His gluttony reached a level that defied belief, as he consumed enough food to feed an entire village, all while his body deteriorated from the inside out. But it wasn't just about the quantity. His food rituals and the bizarre beliefs surrounding his meals transformed him into a figure of grotesque excess. Henry's daily caloric intake was staggering. It is estimated that he consumed roughly 5,000 calories per day. To put this in perspective, that's more than double what an active adult male is supposed to eat. But Henry wasn't just any man, he was a king, and he ate like one. His meals were monstrous, designed not just to satisfy his hunger, but to make a statement about his power. His typical meal would include an entire roasted pig, multiple whole chickens, various types of fish, and mountains of bread. And let's not forget the wine. Henry consumed enough to float a small boat. His royal kitchen, a vast operation in its own right, prepared over 800 different dishes every day, catering to the king's insatiable appetite. The royal staff worked around the clock to meet the demands of their ruler, yet no amount of food seemed to satisfy Henry's hunger. The scale of this feast was not just about indulgence, it was about control. Henry saw himself as a monarch who had the right to consume whatever he desired, and he did so without restraint. He had the power to command vast quantities of food, and he did so as a demonstration of his rule. But this insatiable hunger wasn't just about luxury, it was a symptom of something darker. As his body grew larger, so did his obsession with his own grandeur. The kingdom had to serve him in every way, from preparing elaborate meals to ensuring that no detail was overlooked. But what made his dietary habits even more bizarre was his belief in the magical powers of certain foods. Henry convinced himself that some foods held mystical properties, ones that could enhance his health, his physical prowess, and even his performance as a lover. He believed that eating swan would make him more graceful, consuming deer would improve his hunting abilities, and oysters would increase his virility. It wasn't just about nutrition, it was about the power of food to shape his very identity. This belief in the magical properties of food pushed Henry to gorge himself on these specific items in vast quantities. The king had become obsessed with the idea that his royal status somehow made him invincible to the consequences of his eating habits. But the truly unsettling part of Henry's gluttony was his obsessive rituals surrounding food. Henry became so paranoid about the possibility of being poisoned that he instituted an elaborate system to protect himself. Before any food entered his mouth, it was first tasted by several servants to ensure it wasn't laced with poison, but it didn't stop there. Henry required his tasters to wait 30 minutes after eating, before he would even think about taking a bite of the same food. The fear of being poisoned was so deeply ingrained in his psyche that it turned mealtime into a bizarre performance. His meals weren't just about satisfying his hunger, they were theatrical events. Every meal was a spectacle, a chance for Henry to reaffirm his power and dominance. He ate in front of his courtiers, with the entire process sometimes stretching to 4 hours. Imagine sitting in a grand hall, surrounded by courtiers, watching as the bloated, rotting king slowly worked his way through a mountain of food, savoring each bite as though the act itself were a display of his unchallenged rule. The power he held over his court was not just political, it was personal. Every bite he took reaffirmed his supremacy. And yet, this was a king who could barely walk, and whose body was falling apart. But Henry's obsession with food didn't just extend to what he ate, it also influenced his policies. He was so consumed by his royal status that he banned certain foods from his court, not because they were unhealthy, but because he believed they were beneath him. Foods that were common to the peasants, turnips, barley, and other humble dishes, were literally illegal at Henry's table. Despite the fact that these foods might have been better for his health, Henry refused to allow them in his presence. His delusions of grandeur made him believe that only the finest foods were worthy of a king, even as his body deteriorated under the weight of his own excess. As Henry's body swelled and his health declined, his eating habits only grew worse. His obsession with food mirrored his increasing sense of entitlement and his belief that he could escape the natural consequences of his actions. His court, his family, and even his doctors were trapped in his web of indulgence and paranoia. And the more he ate, the more his body betrayed him. Henry had become a man whose entire existence revolved around his own excess. unable or unwilling to acknowledge the toll it was taking on his health. But despite the mounting evidence of his declining health, Henry continued to gorge himself, convinced that his royal status somehow made him immune to the consequences of his gluttony. His diet, once a symbol of abundance and power, had become his undoing. It wasn't just his weight or his swollen body that had betrayed him, it was his refusal to face the truth about his own destruction. And in his final years, as he sat in his palaces, surrounded by the best food that money could buy, Henry VIII was no longer a king, he was a prisoner of his own appetite, a living testament to the dangers of unchecked indulgence. Henry VIII's later years were a maelstrom of paranoia, fear, and distrust, a culmination of decades of living as a ruler, consumed by both power and insecurity. The man who once ruled England with a firm and confident hand now lived in constant fear of betrayal, fear of assassination, and above all, fear of losing control. As his body decayed and his mental state worsened, Henry's empire became a kingdom of terror. No longer was his reign about absolute authority, it was about survival, and Henry would go to any length to preserve his life, no matter the cost. Let's begin with the extraordinary lengths to which Henry went to protect himself. His paranoia had reached a level so extreme that he slept with loaded crossbows beside his bed and daggers under his pillow. But these were not his only precautions. Inside his chambers, armed guards were stationed at all hours, watching him sleep, ready to defend him against any possible assassination attempt. Imagine the scene. The King of England, once a powerful figure revered by millions, now living in a constant state of anxiety, surrounded by weapons, spies, and a fortress-like palace. The palace itself, once a symbol of grandeur, had been transformed into a maze of secret passages, hidden tunnels, and concealed doors. These weren't built for convenience or luxury, they were designed as escape routes. Henry had them constructed so that, should an assassin try to take his life, he could flee to safety. This, in itself, speaks volumes about the king's psyche. His life had become a living nightmare of suspicion. Every courtier, every servant, every noble was a potential threat in Henry's eyes. Henry's obsession with security didn't end at his own personal safety. He turned his entire court into a surveillance state, where spying was not only encouraged but expected. He created a network of spies whose job it was to watch his courtiers, keeping tabs on their every move, their every conversation. But Henry's paranoia didn't stop there. He had spies watching his spies. It became a twisted web of informants, creating an environment where no one knew who they could trust. In such a climate of fear, a simple remark, an unintended glance, or a whispered word could spell the end for anyone caught in the web of suspicion. But Henry didn't just spy on his court, he even had his own children watched. His daughters, Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, were no exception to his extreme distrust. Henry, convinced that his own flesh and blood were plotting against him, had spies keeping tabs on them as well. These were his daughters, the very women who would one day inherit the throne. But to Henry, they were enemies to be monitored, as if they were potential traitors. The king's paranoia had infected not only his court but his family as well. This climate of fear and mistrust extended into even the most mundane aspects of life. Take Henry's food paranoia, for example. By now, you've already heard about the lengths to which he went to ensure his food was safe. But the madness didn't stop with the tasters. Henry had his food prepared in entirely sealed kitchens. Guards would oversee the cooking process, ensuring that no one had the opportunity to poison the king. And even the salt, the spices, and the water, all of these had to be tested by different people, each with a different guard watching them. It wasn't just about protecting himself from poison. It was about control, about knowing that everything he consumed was completely under his command. But the ultimate horror was Henry's actions in his final days. By this point, his health had deteriorated so much that he could no longer walk unaided. He was carried everywhere in a specially designed chair with pulleys and wheels, a horrifying image of a king who had once been the most powerful man in Europe, now reduced to a prisoner of his own body. His leg wounds, which had plagued him for years, had become so severe that pieces of rotting flesh would literally fall off as he was moved. Servants were forced to follow behind him, cleaning up the decaying remnants of their king. The smell was unbearable. Even Henry's doctors, who had grown accustomed to the horrors of medieval medicine, couldn't stomach it. They would leave his room in disgust, overcome by the stench of decay. But Henry was no longer the king of Europe's most powerful nation. He was a living corpse, a man whose very presence was a reminder of the ravages of time, disease, and his own excesses. When Henry finally passed away in 1547, his death was as horrific as the final years of his life. His body, swollen beyond recognition, was too large for his coffin, which had to be reinforced with lead sheets to contain the mass of decomposing flesh. And yet, even with all the precautions taken, the funeral procession became a disaster. As Henry's coffin was transported from London to Windsor Castle, the gases from his decomposing body built up so much pressure that the coffin literally exploded. The lead lining burst open, spilling his rotting remains into the hearse. The stench was so unbearable that the funeral procession had to halt, and servants were forced to clean the mess with buckets and rags. Perhaps the most grotesque detail of all, dogs were reportedly seen licking up the remains of Henry VIII that had leaked from his coffin. The man who had once ruled England with absolute power had been reduced to nothing more than a feast for scavengers. Even in death, he was unable to escape the consequences of his own decaying body. But it didn't end there. The burial itself was an ordeal. Henry's grave had to be dug extra wide to accommodate his enormous coffin, and even then, the soil couldn't support the weight of his remains. The ground kept collapsing, and it took multiple attempts to get the king's body into the earth. His tomb, meant to serve as a final resting place for one of the most powerful monarchs in history, became a symbol of the chaos that had defined his life. In the years following Henry's death, strange noises and awful smells emanated from his tomb. Some claimed it was the restless spirit of the king, but historians believe it was likely the gases continuing to escape from his decaying remains. The legend of Henry VIII's death continued to haunt those who had lived through his reign. Even in death, the chaos he had created lived on. Henry's legacy isn't just about his role in establishing the Church of England or his 6 marriages. It's about a man whose paranoia, gluttony, and obsession with power turned him from a revered king into a grotesque, tragic figure. His reign was not just marked by the rise of a new religious order, but by the destruction of everything around him: his wives, his court, his own body, and ultimately, his own sanity. Henry VIII's life and death were a masterclass in how absolute power can corrupt a man to the point where he becomes unrecognizable, a shadow of the king he once was, a legacy of fear, madness, and decay